Hi, everybody. Welcome back to day two of game design. We are going to go ahead and get started real quick with just a quick video. So I'm going to go ahead and start that now for you guys. I'm also going to go ahead and post the video in the chat to send out to you guys. So if you guys are not able to watch it on the screen, you guys are more than welcome to check it out at a later time.
Awesome. Thanks, Chelsea. And just a reminder, this is the video that we were kind of finishing out yesterday's session with. Hey, everybody, just turned on my webcam. Wanted to just remind you that yesterday we talked a lot about the foundation of game design. And today we're going to be talking about a lot of game design terminology that you need to know and be familiar with as you design your own. And so I thought it was really important to hear from a couple people who actually do this professionally, that they actually design board games in this case. We talked about a lot of different mediums that you might work in for your game, but to listen to these folks on their discussion around board games, both for some of the terminology we talked about yesterday, the various elements of a board game, but also start to listen to the terminology that they use, because a lot of the words that they talk about will be defining as part of today's presentation. So with that, Chelsea, go ahead and take it away.
When I first met Travis in college, he told me he wanted to be a management consultant. I liked him and I liked the idea of his stable, predictable career. So we dated, we got married, and life was just as I'd pictured it for about 2 weeks. See, at this point, Travis told me that instead of having that stable, predictable career, he wanted to make board games.
In my defense, I like to think that the signs were there. I grew up playing board games with 8 overly competitive siblings, and we always enforced pretty intense house rules. So it wasn't totally out of the blue when we decided to build our own board game.
And I had dabbled in graphic design as the editor of my high school yearbook. So, armed with my limited Photoshop experience and a few design principles I'd picked up, I set out to design this board game Travis had been dreaming of. I quickly realized I needed some help, so we hired an illustrator to work with us as well.
We spent about a year designing and testing the game, and then we put it on Kickstarter, hoping to earn enough money to make some copies for friends and family. We pushed the launch button and waited, and then somehow a stranger came across our idea, put their faith in us, and ordered a copy of the game. We were thrilled. And then 3,000 other people did the same, and we were terrified.
So we dove in, and we learned everything we could about working with factories, shipping pallets, and selling to retailers. And since then, we've sold over 100,000 games, and we now both work from home full-time making games. Right now, we're working on number 5, and as we look back at our process, we've noticed some patterns start to emerge. So here's an idea of what the process of building a board game might look like for us.
One of the most common questions we receive is, how do you get the ideas for your games? Well, the ideas that provide that initial spark for version 1 come from lots of places.
They might come from looking at the notes of an old economics or history lesson.
They come from observing a new culture or castle when we travel.
Or maybe they come from playing existing games and combining the mechanics in new ways.
They come from the 2 or 3 emails we get each week from the guys who claim they've come up with the next $1 million game idea and want to give us a cut of the action.
But wherever they come from, one idea tends to stand out above the rest, and we get so excited to test it out. And we build some basic game rules, and just with this optimism that we have landed on an absolute gem, we test it out. And it's always so bad.
For version 2, we completely scrap the first idea and go back to the drawing board for about the next 7 versions.
And for these early versions, we really try to fail quickly so that we don't get stuck on a path that isn't going to work. So this means Travis and I sit and play the game over and over, changing rules and mechanics as we go, and this might sound like fun. We're playing games all the time. But essentially, we're playing bad games for weeks on end. This is called playtesting, and it can be brutal, especially since our games are classified as social deduction, which means they're all about deception and manipulation. Our games also have high player counts, so we each have to simulate several players. So when you're acting as 3 different characters who are all lying to each other, it can really get overwhelming.
Around version 16, we've added all sorts of exciting elements like card drafting, dice rolling, set collection, and pretty soon the game starts to feel like the Cones of Dunshire. It's just way too complex, and it starts to feel like work to actually play it. So we begin the most important and the most difficult part of creation, which is subtraction. Now, creators have a natural tendency to love and nurture new ideas, but to make a game that is simple to understand yet intriguing to play, you have to get into the habit of continually subtracting unnecessary or clunky ideas from the game.
Now, around version 18, thankfully, we're recruiting new playtesters. We have been so fortunate to have a great group of friends come to our house weekly and suffer through our latest prototype. And this really is key to finding what does and doesn't work for the game, because good playtesters will encourage us to keep going and tell us what they like about the game. But the best playtesters really just rip our games to shreds with their feedback, and that honesty is invaluable.
Around version 21, we start to incorporate a theme. One of our guiding questions is, who do players get to be while they're in our world? A colonist accused of witchcraft? A pirate mutinying against a devious captain? Or an outlaw robbing a safe behind his buddy's back? If players get to be someone else while they're playing, they can much more easily enter into that state of flow and get lost in the world that we've built for them.
Now, somewhere around version 30, things start to get exciting. For example, I once had to work late and came home to a playtest night already in progress. So when I opened the front door, I expected to see 4 or 5 friends sitting at our table testing out our latest pirate-themed game. So you can imagine my surprise when I opened the door and walked into what I can only describe as a full-on pirate jamboree with standing room only. See, our playtesters had spread the word about our game, and as a result, our apartment was crammed with people wanting to play. Many of them had voluntarily come dressed as pirates. So this is really the kind of stuff that we look for to give us some motivation to keep going and tells us we're doing good.
And then, around version 37, I have a meltdown. Something feels off and things just aren't progressing like they should, and at this point, I'm ready to scrap the whole thing and go back to version 1.
And this is when I do everything I can to talk him out of it, because remember, I will do anything to avoid going back to playtesting with just the 2 of us.
But sometimes she doesn't talk me out of it, and the game is banished to my Island of Misfit Games Google Drive folder. If it does survive my meltdown, it still undergoes a major change at this point. The core mechanic is gutted, or the entire theme is changed to better fit the current direction of things.
Near version 49, we're watching our playtesters closely for certain signs of engagement. Now, you might think that we're looking for satisfied smiles during gameplay, but really the best metric that shows us the progress of our game is actually screaming. If we can get players to scream during a game, we know we're pulling out real emotion with the mechanics and that we're on a good track.
From versions 50 to 70, we focus on the 3 ingredients that make up the secret sauce of a great game. Balance, making sure that cards and player abilities aren't overpowered. Autonomy, making sure that the level of luck and skill is just right so that players feel like they control their own destiny, but they're still responsible for leveraging good fortune and surviving unlucky rolls of the dice. And replayability, making sure that the conditions are a little different every time people play so that each time they get out the game, it feels like a new experience.
Now, around version 71, we get to shift our focus to design. And we're really trying to build this immersive world for our players to get lost in, right? So we look for colors and textures that complement the theme. And we also start to work with our brilliant illustrator who really gives life and style to the game. And since there are literally thousands of board games released each year, we also focus heavily on our packaging. And we actually package our games as books to help them stand out.
In the last few versions, we start to incorporate our factory and keep them in the loop. We talk with them about the components we want to use in the game, and we go back and forth with price quotes and game samples. Sometimes 60,000 dice are painted bright neon yellow instead of mustard yellow, but we're always able to work through these types of bumps in the road. In reality, we're really fascinated by this part of the process. It really feels like in today's world, if you can imagine something, a factory out there can create it.
And finally, somewhere around version 87 or so, and about a year into this process, we get to manufacture our game and send it out into the world. And we imagine this is a little bit like sending a kid off to college. We've prepared it in every way that we can, and now it's on its own, and it's vulnerable to the real world. For us, that means YouTube reviews, Twitter comments, and Amazon stars. But whatever happens, we're proud of the game, we wish the best for it, and it's time for us to start again at version 1 with a new idea.
Now, we know that none of you make board games for a living. We know this because we've already met most of the people who do. But each of you is a creator in some way.
And whether you deal with books or art or business or even in your family, your process is going to be different than ours, but we probably have a lot in common, like that need to subtract and simplify, or to have a consistent test group, or to put focus on thoughtful packaging and design.
Whatever it is that you create, we hope that something we've shared about our process will help you move forward with your next version. And if your idea is still waiting in the wings and hasn't yet left your mind, we hope that you'll start with your version 1 soon. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, once again, everybody, welcome back to Game Design. This is day 2 with us. You know, here, and I'm just thrilled everybody have ever. If you had issues with the video or you joined later, Chelsea posted the link to that YouTube video in the link set here. And I'm also going to make sure that it is embedded on our resource page for this website so you can watch it. And even if you did watch it with us here at the beginning of our class, watch it again. Actually, that video is one of the best that I found that really talked through the process of game design. And remember, they're talking board games, tabletop games, but they can really be that what they talked about there applies to the design process of just about any style of game. And hopefully you guys heard some key elements from our conversation yesterday. One of the things that I immediately noticed is that they talked about developing and testing their game and then making changes to things, their characteristics, their resources, some of the elements that we talked about as basic foundational. I heard a lot of them. One of the other things that I like about that talk is that it hit on 3 or 4 vocab words that we are going to cover today as part of the basic vocabulary that you need as a game designer. I wanted to start out today actually by addressing some of the questions that were asked on yesterday's talk. I think you guys had some great questions and suggestions. Several of you put out some thoughts and ideas based on your intention for game design and what you plan on submitting for your design. That's great. We're going to actually talk about that, developing that concept and submitting that concept for approval through our system tomorrow. So if you've got a burning question about, well, I've got this idea and would it be okay for me to do this, we're going to focus most of our time tomorrow on how you can go about doing that and some of the recommendations that I have on your approach. So you can hold those questions for right now. I recorded the ones that were asked and I'll be able to address those in detail tomorrow. One of the first questions that I wanted to address was someone commented or questioned the idea of games evolving over time. I think from our video today, we saw that really they go through almost 100 different versions of any of their games. In some cases, they go into a 50th evolution of that game before a designer ever gets in there. That should really make you feel confident in the work that you're going to do, because you're going to spend the next week or 2 probably just doing things like you saw them do, using pieces of paper and drawing concepts and writing out cards by hand to test run your game. Notice also that a big part of their process is testing the game. They have a cool idea, they throw it on the table, they try it, and then they try it again, and then they try it again, and evolution happens naturally. Requirements 6 and 7 of this merit badge are all about you testing it and testing it and testing it. So the process we just listened to is actually the process you'll be using as part of this badge going forward. Someone asked if there was a requirement, several of you asked actually related to video games, if there was a requirement to play a video game. There's not a requirement specifically to play a video game, but remember your daily submission from yesterday focused on games you've played And I suggested one or two of those could certainly be a video game that you've experienced as part of your study of those 6 main elements of a game. So video games can definitely come into play here. Someone asked if a game can have multiple objectives, and of course the answer to that is certainly yes. Now remember, we talked yesterday about the fact that having too many objectives can make gameplay more complicated and ultimately make your game challenging, but maybe even less fun to the players. So it's a really good recommendation to keep your objectives simple and straightforward, and probably only deal with 2 or 3 objectives to meet within a certain sitting of the game. But think about what our video just said. One of the things that they try to do, obviously, is simplify, as I just said, but they also want replay value. They want to make sure that there's something that's going to bring you back and make you play it again. So perhaps you add in objectives that are only playable the second time you play, or perhaps there's additional objectives that you can add to the game once the players have gotten the basics of the base game, if we call it that. How complex does your game have to be? We're going to address that tomorrow, but I think I've said it now a couple times today, and I certainly mentioned it yesterday. It doesn't have to be all that complex. In fact, a lot of times simpler is better. And we'll talk a little bit about where you can get more complex or less complex in your mechanics as we talk today and especially tomorrow. A couple more here. Someone was asking in relation to a very specific game, and that was discussing whether or not role-playing game franchises became popular based on the release of Knights of the Old Republic. I don't have a lot of immediate experience with that particular game, but I can tell you for sure that role-playing games as a concept were launched much before the launch of that game. Role-playing games actually existed before video games did, and you can look no further than the growing resurgence of popularity of something like Dungeons and Dragons. Now that is a text-based, story-based game that people play, but that is essentially also a role-playing game. And I'm sure you could think of other role-playing games out there, but even going back to the earliest time in video games, role-playing games have always had a part. There was some questions about resources, programs, and websites to use for the development of your games. We're going to look at a few tomorrow. Now they can be digital. A couple of them that we'll look at will be to put together a game that can be launched digitally in the form of kind of a small video game. But there's also websites and other resources out there if you want to try your hand at developing another style of game. I'm going to point you in the direction of a few of them. How are we going to submit our game? We're going to talk about that tomorrow in detail, but you will submit it as you do your daily submissions. There will be an upload opportunity where you can upload drawings of your concept as well as pictures of your playtesting. And those are going to be kind of the 2 main ways that we're going to submit for review on this, is uploading drawings of the things that you're putting together as part of your plan, and then uploading photos of your playtesting with your family so that we can see your game in action. I loved this question. I don't know who put it out there, but if Pac-Man was put into a board game, would it still be considered an electronic game? And I think that was a great question based on our discussion around medium yesterday. I did mention the fact that if you're playing a card game or Monopoly on a video game platform, you've got to kind of still consider Monopoly at its base a board game. But this one kind of flipped it and said, well, if you take a video game and turn it into a board game, is it still technically a video game? That is a great consideration, and I would say that that's certainly pointing out the fact that no rules in the way that you kind of specifically narrowly define medium, no perfect rule exists. In this case, if we talked about someone being, I think, very inventive and coming up with a way of creating Pac-Man in a board game or even a card game or some other style of game, you'd have to then call that a board game. You would have to call that a board game that was based on a video game. Similarly, I think I would make that allowance for my own example and say that if you were playing a video game of Monopoly, you could call it a video game based on a board game. And that would be a good way of kind of categorizing that medium. The question came up, and I think I addressed it yesterday, but I wanted to address it again. What medium will you be working in? You know, this person was asking, are we doing board and card games, or are we designing video games? You're going to design a game based on your interests and based on the mediums that are accessible and interesting to you. Now, I will say that it is probably going to be easier for the majority of our participants here to do something in the card game or board game world medium. Not only are video game designs take a while and take some specialized resources depending on what you're creating, but they are also, you know, take some more development in your skill base and other resources that you may not have at hand. Whereas if you have some blank sheets of paper available, you could put together a prototype for a board game or a card game fairly easily. In fact, as we've discussed, you can take existing resources like a regular deck of cards, combine it with some dice, and create your own rule set around it without having to reproduce some brand new art or build anything for your game to be functional. So my recommendations are going to stay within the world of board games and card games, although I will point you in a couple directions for some easy to use resources to do some electronic games as well. I'm going to give you the opportunities to use your creativity and kind of put that to work in the medium of your choice. And I do have to say at this time that several of you threw out some really good ideas, things that you were interested in, and someone even said, you know, I've done this a bunch of times. I've created some cool games here and there, and imagination is really what you have to make that happen. And I thought that was a really good observation. Someone asked about spinners, like in the game of life. You spin the wheel. Is that categorized under dice games? I would say that life is a great example of a board game that uses a spinner to help you navigate that board game world. Just like Monopoly uses dice to help you navigate the board game world of Monopoly. So always keep in mind, how do you interact with the game at its core? That is going to tend to be your medium. So if you use dice in a role-playing game, it's still a role-playing game or a text-based game, even though you're using that dice. However, if you are using the dice to do pretty much everything except keep score, like in the case of Yahtzee, that is a dice game because the dice are the main way that you're interacting with the game. And then finally, the last question I just wanted to touch on here was someone had talked about taking a couple different games and fusing them together, the baseline rules of two existing games, and then adding a twist. And I think that's certainly a good way to approach your design if you want to go that route. There's nothing wrong with taking a couple ideas and bringing them together in a totally new way, and then kind of changing things just enough to say this is different than that other game I know. In fact, our video actually started out with that as one of the places where they get ideas. They like a couple different games, they see how they might be able to meld, and then they put their own theme on it, which we remember that as one of the 6 elements we talked about yesterday. By adding a different theme to the basic gameplay of an existing game, you can create a lot of really creative games. So with that, I want to transition into our presentation for today. And we are going to be focusing our time today on requirement 2. Requirement 2 for Game Design Merit Badge states that you need to discuss 5 of 17 game design terms. And for each term that you pick, for each of those 5, you need to describe how it relates to a specific game. So the way this is going to work is that we're going to go through 17 pretty standard basic design terms. I trust that you will recognize a few of these from your own experience. You will definitely recognize a few of them from the video that we started today with. But you're going to learn about 17 of them. You're going to pick 5 that you want to focus on. And in one of your daily submissions, you're going to list out those 5, and you're going to give a specific example of a game, and a game that you're familiar with, and how that term relates to it. And we'll talk about some examples as we go here on how that could work in your submissions. So let's get going, because there are 17 of these that I want to cover and discuss with you. Now, we categorize these, we group them in a few different ways, and the first grouping we're going to look at are thematic elements. Now, in case you forgot yesterday going over our 6 basic elements of a game, you will remember theme was kind of an optional one. It doesn't always relate to all games, but a majority of games you find some level of theme, and there are 3 terms that we want to focus in on as they relate to theme. The first one is the story, and I would expect that you can come up with a definition pretty easily, but it's the narrative. It is the storyline presented in the game. We can all think of a lot of video games probably that have a story, a narrative that happen. You can also think in the terms of a game I've referenced a couple times today, and that's Dungeons and Dragons, an opportunity to do a tabletop text-driven game experience. And we know that that is actually a player-created story. There's a lot of examples too where games kind of evolve and their story changes based on decisions that you as the player make. So it's definitely important for us to think of story as a key element of theme. Setting is another one. Setting is the place that the game takes shape. This is the environment that the game exists in. Again, it's very easy for us to think and live in the world of video games, but think of a couple board games that take place in an environment. You could look at something that's kind of literal, thinking in terms of a board game like Risk or Pandemic that utilizes a map, the world. It's a worldwide game experience. Or you can look at a game like I had it for a second and I lost it. You can look at another game like another board game like Life, which happens a little bit more in an open-ended setting. But the setting is really a place that establishes a lot of important elements for theme, and it can impact gameplay. Remember that the setting of your game will often impact the way that the game is played, because setting invites limitations. Use an example like Risk, what I just brought up earlier, where navigation around the board is limited by the way the continents are laid out. So your setting not only establishes really good thematic elements, but starts to shape gameplay. I thought of the other example, and that is actually using the style of game that the video was looking at. The couple that design those games, they tend to work in the world of kind of a combination of card game and board game, and their games unfold throughout a lot of interchange of cards. And their game mechanics, I've seen a couple of their games. Their game mechanics are pretty basic, and in fact, a lot of their games use the same mechanics over and over again from one game to the other. The difference is that they're set in a different environment, a different storyline, and a different time. So think of setting not just as the space, the world that it lives in, but also the time period. Maybe you'll make your game more interesting just simply by saying, well, it's a basic game, but it happens in the Stone Ages, and so you have to use these unique mechanics because we're cavemen. So setting is time and place. And then characters, and this is a great example also to look at our video. Remember the pictures and the observations that they made where when they were playtesting one time around, they had their friends show up, and most of them showed up in pirate costumes because they were testing a pirate game. The characters come to life and help bring the story and the theme to life for the players. So as you think about designing your game, if you choose to go in the direction of a card game or a board game, maybe there's an aspect of the gameplay and setup that assigns each individual player a character. And maybe that character helps inform the kinds of things that they can do within the game. Another great example I've used before and I'll continue using as just an innovative approach is the game Pandemic. This is a game, of course, that rather than being competitive, it's collaborative. It's a cooperative player environment. At the start of that game, every single player gets a different character. And those characters can move throughout the board and do different actions all differently. And it's the interplay of those different character designs that allow the game to be different every time you play it. So these thematic elements, remember that hanging a story on gameplay can be fun and interesting, but it can also directly relate to your gameplay. It can change the way the game is played by putting an interesting setting into it or challenging the players to inhabit the world of a character that somehow changes the mechanics of the game itself. Gameplay elements are the next category. We looked at theme, now we're looking at the actual gameplay. And I've already said it, but remember that all of these different terms can interrelate in interesting ways. The effort of categorizing them just helps us remember them a little bit better. So as we move from theme to gameplay, there are the first three key elements here that we're going to look at are play sequence, level design, and interface design. So play sequence is something we talked about yesterday a little bit. It's how the players interact in the game and what order they play in. And this can be simple. You know, we go clockwise in this game, so I start playing, and then the person to my left, and the person to their left, and the person to their left. That's fairly basic play sequence. You can also look at something where pairs of players need to do things together. So maybe the player across from you in a card game, perhaps, could be part of a team. And the two of you do certain actions and play certain ways throughout the game based on a specific play sequence for that game. But you can also see some really complex play sequence come out. There are games that have you each individual player doing a number of different actions at the same time. And as you do your action, it impacts what the other player can do. Let's think of a card game many people know. It's a game called, well, there's a number of variations actually. You can look at two games. There's a game called Speed, and there's a game called Spoons. And they're different games. They're not variations on each other, but they're both games that are played kind of with player sequence that is simultaneous. Now, Spoons is a game where you're passing cards usually to your left and around the circle, but players are taking action all simultaneously. You aren't doing something in your hand, passing to the left and then waiting. There's a simultaneous gameplay happening around the table until, of course, someone gets the right set in their hands and can then grab up a spoon. And if your family is like my family, that becomes a game in and of itself. The game Speed is a two-player game, and again, simultaneous play sequence. The players are playing and exchanging cards from cards that are in front of them and eventually making a hand. So there are different games and different play sequences that you can introduce. And as we talked about before, you don't need to stick to just one. You might have a game design that says we all go one round counterclockwise to do one series of steps, and then all of us do something together. Having 47 different variations on play sequence in a single game is not advisable, but having 2 or even 3 different ways that your play sequence happens in different phases of the game can really be an interesting way of creating a new and different game. And that actually brings us to level design. Now, creation of the game environment is the basic definition of level design. And all of you immediately thought of your favorite video game when I said level design. And that is definitely a place where we see this really, really well put together. Whether we're talking about older video games where you've got Mario going through a variety of levels and their basic numbered variations on a theme, or if you're talking about more complex, large world games where you're maybe exploring a large open area and then finding your way into specific platform design levels, video games really rely on interesting level design a lot. But let's get out of video games for a second and actually think about how you could design a game in cards or on a board that uses a level design as well. My example with play sequence, which I'm inventing a game as I go here in our discussion, but imagine if you have 3 levels of the game that you have to complete. And the first level is very simple. It feels a lot like a game of Go Fish. And so you're dealing with cards and you're trading cards across the board, and it's a fairly simple play sequence. But once the first person gets their proper set, they clear their hand, now they're using the hand that they've created to do something entirely different within the game. You call that level 2. And that changes the way the environment, your tabletop in this case, is worked with it. And as they complete whatever the tasks are there, maybe it feels a little bit like solitaire meets war. And once they've completed those elements, or you've got everyone on level 2, then boom, the game adapts and changes. And now you're taking the new sets of cards that you've created and you're using those to play the best hand of poker. Now you see how you can actually create multiple levels within a totally different platform for your game. I would also make a point here and use another example of a card game. There are a number of different versions of card games, and you can find them out there that marry together 3 or more games. One common one that I've played before is literally called Tripoli. And it is a game that combines 3 different, very common, very traditional card games, but it's in the way that you interact as you develop your hand that really makes the game new and challenging every time you play it. Interface design is the third gameplay term that we want to look at, and you've had time now to read it as I've talked about these other 2, but it's all about how do you interface, not just with the game board or the set of cards or with the video game, but also how you might interact with players. Remember that interface can be a controller in your hand or the cards that you're holding or your piece going around the board, but it can also be what rules dictate your ability to tell things to other players or to withhold information from other players. Your interface across the table or through the gameplay itself can all really impact how the game is experienced. Game analysis is our 4th category, and we've got 4 items, vocabulary items that we want to look at here. Number 1 is difficulty. This goes back to a question we got yesterday about complexity. I said we're going to talk more about that today and tomorrow, and difficulty could be paired with complexity, which is another term we see on the page here. They go hand in hand. Difficulty is how easy or hard is it to complete the objectives. One could say that Monopoly is a very difficult game. It's certainly a difficult game to complete in a timely manner, especially if everyone is as focused on winning as possible. The card game Go Fish is a fairly easy game, although the more players, the more difficult it becomes. So remember that the difficulty can change a little bit depending on how many objectives you put into the game and how many players are all vying to win that game. Balance is another term, and actually this was used in the video. It's the relative strength of all the stuff that goes into the game. Resources we talked about yesterday, the different items that you have to collect or use, the gameplay mechanics, the goals or objectives set out, and sort of what that starting point is. All of those things need to be in balance. Think of this as an example. If you start a game with 0 items and the objective is to collect all the items, but the items are so complex to collect and the mechanics are so challenging in the collection of those items, then you have a game that is out of balance. It's also hard if your goal of collecting items requires you to have collected a bunch of items before you can even start collecting the items you need to collect. Using an example in the video game world, one that most people have at least a basic working knowledge, is the Legend of Zelda franchise. I'm using examples of collecting items. One of the big mechanics within that is actually the collection and then eventual use of items. But even if you only have experience with the game in some of the earlier titles that were out, they all really were built around that same concept. But each time you collected an item, you are not often required to use that item until the next level that you experience. So balance is struck by making sure that you aren't asked to do something that is not possible, because they build in a good gameplay flow and the mechanics allow you to collect one item and then use that to collect the next. Keep that in mind as you're thinking about how your own game may strike a good balance. Make sure that all of these things are areas of focus and that no one item no one resource, no one objective is so difficult that you can't move on to the next part of your game. And if that description didn't lead us into complexity, I don't know what would, because that was a very complex definition. Complexity works hand in hand with difficulty and balance, because if you have created such a complex system of mechanics and resources and objectives, nobody's going to want to play your game. I would say they won't want to play it again, and they may not even get through the first experience. A lot of times creating a simple, basic, approachable game that has just enough complexity to challenge a player is going to be your best route, especially if you want to create replay value. And then depth is a hard one to really define, but I think if we think in terms of just how big of an emotional investment a player has, that's one of the best ways of putting depth into perspective. This says the ability to find enjoyment in the game. I think enjoyment is certainly a good emotion to try to get from people. You want them to enjoy playing your game. We heard on the video that one of their tests of success was actually to have people screaming while they're playing the game. That gets at my other definition, which was emotional investment. If you're outraged that you drew the go back 5 spaces cards again because that just happens to be the ongoing mechanic that you keep falling into in a game, and your emotional response is to good-naturedly scream out loud that this is a terrible injustice, that's a fairly good sign. Hopefully you can then laugh about it and move through, because there's an enjoyment in that frustration as well. But the depth of a game is really how deeply invested your players feel as they travel through the game mechanics. There's a lot more in analysis than any of the other categories. We look at some things, and I'm going to group them as I go. Pace is obviously the speed of the game, how quickly or slowly a game goes. There are some games that have too fast of a pace, that there are too many things happening at one time and you're not quite sure what's happening. But honestly, sometimes, like in the case of Spoons or Speed, that fast, frenetic pace is actually part of the fun. That's part of the challenge and complexity of that game, is just simply keeping up with the pace of it. Play value and replay value are the same concept. One happens before the other. Play value is what brings people into the game to sit down and play it the first time, and then replay value is what keeps bringing them back. We heard our video talk about the fact that replay value was one of their top 3 things that they focused on. They wanted to make sure they had a balanced, clear game to play, but they wanted that game to keep people wanting to play it again. When the game is over, man, I want to play that again. Age appropriateness is making sure that the game is really focused on the right age level and maturity level. You don't want too complex a game or too kind of deeply thematic of a game for younger audiences. Maybe that means that there are themes that aren't appropriate for young audiences, but sometimes that just means that the complexity of the theme is going to go over the heads of a young person. And I'm usually thinking about young people younger than our scouts working here. You know, you're not taking a 4 or 5-year-old and having them play Monopoly very effectively, because there's too many moving parts and too many mechanics there. That's why most games come with an age range, just to make sure that the people that sit down around the game are going to enjoy themselves. And then depth, again, I think I ended up redundant on that particular one, but it is an important thing, that enjoyment and emotional investment. We were so invested in that concept, I carried it over to the next slide. And then finally, there's 5 terms that are related in the way that they impact the mechanics of every game. And when we say related terms here, we're talking about the fact that the 2 terms that I have paired here are related to each other. So single player versus multiplayer. We all should understand this concept. Is it one player against the game, or is it multiple players either pitted against each other or all of them working within the game? And we've used a bunch of examples around this already. You can certainly think of a dozen more, I'm sure. Cooperative versus competitive. So here are 2 related terms that we've talked about a little bit today, and I've actually used them as I talked about 2 somewhat similar board games. You think of Risk on one side and Pandemic on the other. And if neither of these games are ones that you've experienced, I encourage you to Google them, because I'll continue using them as interesting examples, because at their heart, they actually use a lot of the same basic mechanics. It's the slight differences that you see in these 2 games that make them really unique in the sense of gameplay. Risk is competitive. Every player for themselves, and they are all vying for the same outcome, and that's to take over the world. The board is a big basic board of the map of the world, and moving around the board is contingent on kind of cycle of play and some other resources and things. There's an interplay of small pieces and cards, very similar to the way that Pandemic is laid out, where it's a board with a map of the world, it's small pieces and cards, all of that interplay is the same. The difference is the Pandemic is cooperative. All of the players are working together to reach the same goal. So when you take 2 at their heart very similar setups in game design and change one thing, whether it's competitive or cooperative, you can change the whole concept of the game. Turn-based versus real-time. Everybody's thinking, okay, I got a great video game that fits this concept. I'm going to once again tell you that's awesome. I'm going to talk about card games again. And we'll look at turn-based like Go Fish, fairly simple, basic turn-based game where I'm going to ask for a card and then take an action, and then you're going to ask for a card and take an action. Unlike Speed or Spoons, where it's technically real time. Everyone is doing actions and activities all simultaneously together. They're using the same basic resources. There's a lot of similarities in the outcome and goal of getting pairs and matches within your hands. But at the end of the day, the way that it's either turn-based or real-time impacts the gameplay significantly. Then there's strategy versus reflex versus chance. So I'll start from the back, and we can think of chance as being a dice game. You know, your roll of the dice in Yahtzee is going to really be very dependent on luck, on chance, on literally the roll of the dice. Chance can also be a game of war with cards, right? Because you don't know what the card is that you're about to pick up. Now, once you've gone through the deck a few times, pretty soon you're getting close, but you also don't know what card they're going to pick up. And it's all in the chance of what comes up. And there's a dozen other card games and dice games and other games that rely on chance only. Reflex is something that generally you could think of, and I'll use examples of various video games as you are navigating the world of just about every Mario Brothers title. You are relying a lot on reflex, whether you jump at the right time, throw something at the right time, hit the right block at the right time. It's all about developing good reflexes. You can also think of examples where one thing in a card game will lead to another, but a lot of times card games are a combination of chance and strategy. Reflex, I find a lot of great examples in the video game world. Strategy then is where you get to think out your next move. You know, basics of checkers and chess, those are strategy games. There are, of course, computer and video based strategy games. There's also card games. Even if you really think about it, there's a certain little dose of strategy in a game like Solitaire, where you have to decide which pile of cards you're going to impact. And if you choose this one, it may close out your options later on. Strategy doesn't always have to just be focused on something like a game such as Stratego, where strategy is kind of in the name, where you know that that's a strategy game. A game like poker is a little bit chance and a little bit strategy. And those two things, the interplay between those two, are what make it a really dynamic game. Realize that these aren't just one or the other. You can experience these terms in certain measures that create an interesting balance. And then, of course, abstract versus thematic. And these I'll define for you backwards as well, starting with thematic. Thematic, we've talked about themes, we've talked about storylines, settings, all of those things that put your game into a world. Abstract is a little bit more like some of the card games I've referenced, you know, Spoons, Go Fish. These are just kind of, I have a set of rules, I have an objective to do this step, I'm using this small set of resources in front of me to make these moves. Way more abstract than something even with in relation to board games, where the board establishes a world that usually has some level of theme. Now, a board game that doesn't is a board game like Parcheesi or Risk, or I'm sorry, Trouble. These are games that just sort of have a space that you navigate and a set of rules, and they are much more abstract than truly thematic. So as you look at these terms, and we'll flip through them very quickly as we wrap today, you've got to remember that you've got thematic elements such as story, setting, and characters that can really develop your game into something rich and also give you replay value, and really interesting mechanics can come out of those things. Gameplay elements like play sequence and level design, and even the way that the players interact with the game and each other, can change the way the gaming environment works and can inform a lot of your rules and a lot of the other actions that happen within the game. And then when you kind of look at just the basic step-by-step analysis of a game, you've got to look at how hard it is. How balanced is it? How complex is it? And remember, difficulty and complexity are two different things with similarities. You've got to look at how emotionally engaging it is in relation to depth of experience, the pace or speed of the game, the play value and the replay value. Why do people play a game and why do people play it again? The age appropriateness, whether or not the game is suitable for all ages or whether there's kind of a threshold of appropriateness for that game. Depth, we already said, was a repeat. And then think about these terms as well. As you're looking at various games that you've experienced, are they single player or multiplayer? Are they cooperative, or is it pitted everybody against each other? Is it a turn-based thing, or is everything happening kind of simultaneously in real time? Is there a strategy that people employ, or is it really based on just the action and reaction of the players? Or is there an element of chance, of luck that's built in? And is the game really abstract and just kind of open-ended as far as what's going on? Or is there a theme that really kind of, you know, defines the structure of the game? So what you're going to do as part of your daily review is you're going to look at games that you have experience with yourself, and you're going to take 5 of these terms and you're going to relate those 5 terms to the games that you have experience with. I also just want to give you a preview of part of what we're going to talk about tomorrow. We're going to visit the idea of intellectual property and talk a little bit about what's important around the ownership of intellectual property. And we're certainly going to talk a little bit about computer games and video games in relation to this, because it's important for us to remember that while I have encouraged you to think about games that you like and maybe tweaking something within those games to make your own new game, you also have to remember that there are certain things about the ownership and creation of a game that belongs to the folks that created it. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the importance of that, and then we're really going to spend most of tomorrow talking about your designs, giving you some ideas on where to start, what resources you can use, and then we'll start talking about how you'll submit your initial design to me by the end of this week, and then you'll be able to play test that during the time next week and hopefully submit final pictures and other kind of proof of concept to wrap up the merit badge at the end of next week. But I'll lay out that timeline tomorrow, and we'll spend the next 2 days then really looking at how you'll make your game from just an idea into reality. So I know that we are hitting right at the end of our hour together. I want to thank everybody for their attention and time today. Chelsea will send me the records from today's questions, and I will do what I did today, and I will start tomorrow with answers to some of those questions. But just make sure you visit the resource site today. You'll have a daily review available where you'll be able to knock off a couple more requirements, and we will see you back here tomorrow starting at 3 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. Chelsea, I've got maybe 30 seconds left on my clock. Is there anything that I just need to hit on real quick, because you've seen the question 1,000 times?
No, just can the game be either a physical game, a board game, a video game, or a card game? Can it be any of those?
Yes.
Okay.
Any of the mediums that we talked about yesterday can be used. I'm going to focus a lot of our discussion around board games and card games because the resources are easily accessible to everybody. And one of the challenges with physical games right now is that in the world of social distancing, you don't have a lot of players to choose from as far as getting a bunch of people together and testing a physical game. And you also, need to be very careful in how you're playing a physical game. And so I'm going to focus on a couple ways and mediums that are easy for everybody to approach. But yes, you have the option of any medium that you want to work in, or even combinations of mediums, and we'll talk about what combinations could look like over the next couple days.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, we will see you tomorrow. Remember, I will send all of these questions over to Mike. So if it did not get answered, he will try to touch on it as best he can tomorrow. We will see you guys tomorrow at 3 Eastern. Have a good day.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. Take it easy. Bye-bye.